Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History with Mr. Ancharsky. This is the second chapter. Oh my God, this is the fourth chapter of our first unit. Today, we're going to explore a little bit about the rise of Islam. So we are going to talk about religion today, as well as its impact on politics and society. So your bell work on the screen, what are some religions we've talked about so far, thinking beyond what we discussed in our last chapter? What are some religions we've seen across world history as of this point? So as I mentioned, today we are going to discuss the development of a region of the world that the AP and historians refer to as Dar-al Islam. And essentially, this roughly translates to the House of Islam, the House of Peace, but it refers to the Islamic world. So today we're going to look at parts that are impacted by the Islamic world. We'll go as far as Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. We'll talk about North Africa a little bit, the Middle East, of course, the Arabian Peninsula, Central Asia, even as far as India. So the Islamic world is massive, as we're going to learn about today. So today you should be able to explain how systems of belief, how religion, i.e. Islam, and their practice influence the Islamic world over time, and then explain the effect of the rise of Muslim states over time as well. And if this was class time, you would discuss this with your partner. What are the two Abrahamic religions we've talked about so far, Christianity and Judaism? And how might people outside of the Mediterranean, how might people outside the Mediterranean Sea world have known about these religions? Well, I'm going to actually answer that in just a second. So today, let's first begin by looking at the rise of Islam as a faith. Let's look also at some basic tenets of that faith as well. But before that, we have to establish what does the Arabian Peninsula, this is where Islam will originate from, what does it look like? Well, pre-Islamic Arabia has to first be defined by its geography, as usual in world history. Because the Arabian Peninsula, as you can see on this satellite map, is largely going to be an arid desert. We aren't really going to see that much settlement in the interior of the Arabian Peninsula. Mostly it's confined along the coast. And these coastal cities, well, they have access to international trade. But there will be some cities that develop within the interior of the Arabian Peninsula. We will have cities that largely will pop up around limited water supplies, including various oases across the Arabian Peninsula. And one of the biggest and most important cities for us today is going to be the city of Mecca, which is around here-ish. But because of the nature of the Arabian Peninsula, we won't really have long-term agricultural societies when we get closer to the interior. Mostly these agricultural societies are along the coast, but how do people in the interior of the Arabian Peninsula make their trade? How do they make their living? Well, largely we do see that the Arabian Peninsula is populated by what we call the Bedouins. The Bedouins are a nomadic society that do live across not just the Arabian Peninsula today, but also within North Africa, and we're going to kind of explore why that is later today. But they are a nomadic society. They are largely clan-based, meaning largely family-based, but these clans are organized into larger tribes as well. But these societies are largely going to be pastoral, meaning that they're largely going to lead lives in which their food production is based on herds of animals. In this case, camels, sheep, goats, horses. So these nomadic societies are largely basing their food production off of limited animal groupings, but we also see that they will supplement their income through trade. They're moving around from water source to water source, from limited grassland to limited grassland. So along the way, they're going to trade stuff. They're going to bring goods with them as they go to other places. So we are going to see a strong merchant economy on the Arabian Peninsula, not just on the coast with the Indian Ocean trade, for example, but also in the interior, we are going to see that a strong merchant tradition emerges among these Bedouin societies. But as I mentioned before, the Bedouin have a rough existence in the fact that they are constantly searching for food. They're constantly searching, rather, I should say, grasslands and limited water supplies for their animals. And as such, that means there's going to be intense competition between these different tribal divisions, between these different groups of people who are competing for limited territory for their animals. And as such, there is not going to be a single politically unified entity on the Arabian Peninsula until what we're going to talk about in a second, until the rise of Islam. But speaking of religion, prior to Islam, we are going to see that largely these groups of people practicing or that live on the Arabian Peninsula are largely going to practice a very generalized religion known as Arab polytheism. So there is obviously multiple gods, but a key aspect of this Arab polytheism is going to be a shrine known as the Kaaba. It's a shrine that is located in one of the biggest cities of the Arabian Peninsula, that being Mecca. But even the Kaaba has origins in Abrahamic traditions, in the traditions of Judaism/Christianity. The Kaaba supposedly was built by Abraham and his son Ishmael, who was his other son that wasn't Isaac. They built this shrine, and they intended it as a monotheistic shrine, but right now it's being utilized as a polytheistic shrine. So it does hold a religious significance. And that makes Mecca a religious center and an economic center. And these ideas are going to continue even after Islam appears. But we're going to look at that right now. So eventually we are going to see the rise of Islam, largely because of this man right here, Muhammad, whose name is spelt out in Arabic calligraphy right here. Muhammad is considered to be the traditional founder of Islam. And he is going to be initially a merchant figure on the Arabian Peninsula. That's how he makes his trade. So he's going to be a prominent local in the city of Mecca. But he's also going to have extensive intellectual and economic contacts with people as far as the Mediterranean Sea. So he is very much influenced by Abrahamic traditions, by Christianity, by Judaism. But where does Muhammad fit on the religious significance of history? Well, starting about 600 CE, Muhammad is going to receive several revelations from the angel Gabriel. So the angel Gabriel is going to deliver messages from God, from Allah, as he's referred to in Arabic, and Allah is going to basically transmit his thoughts, his teachings to the central prophet of Islam, Muhammad. So Muhammad is eventually going to transcribe directly these sayings from God, and he's going to transcribe them into a book in Arabic known as the Quran. So the Quran is going to be the direct word of God according to Muslim faith, according to Islamic faith. So the Quran is unique from, say, the Torah or from the Gospels in the sense that it is considered to be the literal word of God, whereas the Torah, whereas the Gospels, those have human authors. Muhammad is merely the conduit, the transcriber of the direct word of God in Islamic tradition. So this God that Muhammad is communicating with, this God of Allah, the same God as Jesus, the same God as Judaism, he's going to say some basic messages that I'll talk about in just a second. But one of the most important is the fact that there's only one God, and that God is Allah, much like we see with the other Abrahamic traditions. So eventually Muhammad is going to begin teaching to his followers in Mecca. He has a pretty good social standing. He's a merchant. He is of a wealthy means in this society. But he is going to kind of ruffle some feathers among the elite in Mecca. He is saying that there's only one God, that the Kaaba should be used as a shrine to worship this God. and that there are no other gods. So he's challenging the religious authority of important figures in the city of Mecca. And that's going to, as I said before, cause some disagreements. Muhammad's going to be kicked out of Mecca, and he's going to flee to the city of Medina. And in Medina, the word of Islam will spread even more, and eventually we see supporters of Muhammad, Muslims, they are going to rally together politically under the leadership of Muhammad. They're going to build an army, and they're going to invade the city of Mecca in 622. Then we have a kind of political entity that is unifying these two major cities of Medina and Mecca. So from here, we start to see the earliest Islamic empire. We're starting to see a multi-territorial kingdom emerge under the organization of Islam. But let's look at exactly what some teachings are of Islam and why it's going to be so gosh dang popular on the Arabian Peninsula and well beyond. Well, Islam is oftentimes considered the third Abrahamic religion, meaning that it does follow a lot of the same traditions as Christianity and as Judaism. The prophets of these religions, people like Abraham and Moses, but also Jesus, and specific to Christianity, they're considered different prophets of Allah, of God. Muhammad is merely the last of these prophets and the most accurate, according to Islamic tradition. But a big part of the Muslim faith is understanding this key document of the Islamic faith, that being the Quran, meaning this is the written word of God that has to be understood by followers of this faith. Therefore, literacy is very important. Therefore, education and understanding these key concepts is very important. We also have another collected work of Islamic writings known as the Hadith. This is the kind of sayings of Muhammad. So these two texts are kind of the big basis of the religion in Islam. Quran obviously being the more important one, but the Hadith also having significance as well. But understanding these texts is very important in Islamic faith, and it's going to help us explain the Islamic culture that will emerge later on. But a big aspect of Islam is the so-called 5 pillars. And you don't need to memorize exactly what all of them are. But there are 2 important ones that I will talk about at the end. For one thing, we have this tradition of fasting that is going to take place during the month of Ramadan, which oftentimes corresponds to roughly May or June in the Gregorian calendar. So we have this tradition of fasting. We have these religious calendar. We have the idea of prayer. Muslims, this will kind of vary depending on certain divisions we'll talk about in just a second. But most Muslims, meaning most Sunni Muslims, they pray towards the direction of Mecca at least 5 times a day. There are calls to prayer in Islamic communities that are offered from the minarets of mosques. And essentially, this is reminding Muslims that it's time to pray. So we have prayer mats, we have praying directed in the direction of the Kaaba, of the Mecca. So wherever you are in the world, there's an importance of knowing which way is Mecca. That might have some scientific implications in a second. But we also have this strict idea of monotheism, that Allah is God, and that Muhammad is his messenger, is his prophet. That is the essential idea of Islamic monotheism, the creed, the Shahadat. But the 2 most important, at least historically for us anyway today, is these ideas of charity, of zakat, meaning that all Muslims are expected to provide charitable donations to the community. This is an important aspect of why Islam's going to be so gosh dang popular. There is this message of social justice, much like we saw with Judaism, much like we saw with Christianity, early Christianity. But we also have a religious practice known as the Hajj, known as pilgrimage. So essentially, Hajj says that all Muslims have to, at least once in their lifetime, that they are suggested, if you're able to go to Mecca and worship at the Kaaba, to worship at this central shrine in the Islamic faith. So the pilgrimage is going to explain why Islam will have such a international focus, because it is going to draw Muslims from around the world, as we will see, to this religious center in Mecca. So we do have a very strong international presence emerging in the Middle East that has an economic, political, and religious significance. But building off of why Islam's going to be so popular, well, for one thing, Islam provides a sense of shared community. We are going to see that there is a religious community that transcends not just tribal and clan divisions, but linguistic ones as well. So we call the kind of international Islamic community, the community of believers, this is known as the Ummah. So this sense of community building is very much going to be a major reason why Islam is going to be so attractive, especially to Islamic rulers. There is a shared religious identity that transcends tribal and class divisions. And this provides a sense of, in a sense, nation building. A shared community with shared religious values. That's going to be the basis of many Islamic empires. But also there is this expectation of understanding a shared common language of Arabic. Arabic is going to be basically spoken and understood by Islamic communities across the Islamic world, not just in the Arabian Peninsula. But another reason why Islam is going to be so popular is this idea of equality. And there is equality to every person in the sense that everyone has to submit to God, to Allah. And in fact, the word Muslim, which describes a person who is a follower of Islam, the word Muslim literally translates to one who submits to Allah, one who submits to God. So this idea of equality is kind of breaking down class divisions through a shared religious identity. But also this idea of zakat, this idea of charity, is very much an important aspect of Islamic faith as well. So Islamic rules, the Sharia, as we'll talk about, that applies to everybody, regardless of whether or not you're a king, regardless if you're a peasant. It applies to everybody, and there is a very generous sense of social justice and charity in Islam, as we will see. So you should be able to identify some key beliefs of Islam and why it might be appealing to new groups of people. However, despite the fact that Islam does create a sense of community, we are going to see political divisions that will eventually translate to religious divisions. And that is going to lead us to the two big branches of Islam, Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. And it mostly has to do with at the time, political issue. So Muhammad is kind of a religious and political figure after he unites Medina and Mecca. But he's eventually going to die in 632. He is going to, according to Islamic tradition, ascend into heaven in the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is very big for three major religions, as you might be able to identify by now. So after Muhammad's death and after his ascension into heaven, there's going to be this question of who is going to be the political and religious leader of Islam following Muhammad. And we call this position the Caliph. The Caliph is the successor to Muhammad, and it is an important religious and political leadership position in the Islamic tradition, in Islamic faith. And really, there are going to be two contenders that emerge. One is going to be a guy by the name of Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr is Muhammad's father-in-law. And the followers who believe that Abu Bakr should be the caliph, they're going to contend that the caliph is someone that is decided on by the learned members of the Islamic community, of the Islamic Ummah. So there is going to be a gravitation by a majority of Muslims towards Abu Bakr, and this is going to result in a branch of Islam known as Sunni Islam. So Sunni Islam initially begins as this political division, but even to this day, we still have followers of this branch of Islam that comprises about 85% of Muslims today.
The other major branch is Shia Islam, and Shia Islam largely going to be kind of the minority in the Islamic world. They are going to say that the successor, the caliph to Muhammad, has to be a member of Muhammad's family. In this case, a guy by the name of Ali. Ali is the cousin of Muhammad. He's also the son-in-law. So we are going to see that there is this political division, but it will translate into religious differences as well. Basically, there are some key divisions, religiously speaking, including some ideas of prayer. For example, Shia Muslims believe in praying 3 times a day, whereas Sunni Muslims 5 times a day. There are differences in who's regarded as a saint, who's regarded as an important religious figure. There are differences in the varying shrines. But really, these religious traditions, they are going to translate to divisions even to this day. We still have a divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Most Shia Muslims reside in what is today modern day Iran, and most Sunni Muslims, they live basically everywhere else. And as we'll talk about more in our later units, there is going to be tense differences between Shia and Sunni Muslims. But even though there are these divisions initially in the Islamic world, we are going to see that there is going to be a major spread of this faith. People are going to become very attracted to Islam, but also the political organization Islam provides is going to allow for empires or caliphates to be built. So let's look at the first caliphate, and this is going to be the one that is traditionally understood to be led by Abu Bakr. And this is known as the Rashidun Caliphate. And the Rashidun Caliphate is going to expand beyond Muhammad's original boundaries of just Medina and Mecca. We are going to see the incorporation of the Arabian Peninsula and a little bit beyond that into this new caliphate. So from this political organization, we are going to see a sincere desire to spread Islam. But also we are seeing that there is going to be this territorial quest for more economic opportunity. So we are going to see the Rashidun Caliphate expand beyond the Arabian Peninsula. We will see that the powers of bigger classical empires like the Byzantines and the Sassanid empires, they're going to lose significant amount of power and territory. But if we're thinking about how we are seeing the spread of religion, we're largely going to see the Rashidun Caliphate promote a positive vision of Islam, in the sense that as Islam expands, converts are going to be considered fully equal to Muslims who've been Muslims for quite a while. So there is going to be the peaceful integration of recent converts to Islam in the Rashidun Caliphate, but even people that don't convert to Islam, they are going to have toleration. We are going to see religious tolerance, but yet at the same time, there is going to still be an encouragement that people convert to Islam. So we do see the religious tolerance and religious freedoms of Jews and Christians being respected. They have to pay what is known as the dimony tax, but it's kind of a financial incentive to convert to Islam. That while you might have your tradition still, you still have to pay a tax. But the thing is, if you were a Muslim, you wouldn't have to pay that tax. But also Muslims themselves, they do receive benefits from this new caliphate, from this new government, in the sense that following the practice of zakat, we are seeing that charity is given towards all Muslims, all followers of the faith in the Rashidun Caliphate. Eventually, it is going to collapse. There are divisions over the successor and the succession of this caliphate. And we are going to see a branching off into different caliphates after this initial one. And one of them is the Umayyad Caliphate. The Umayyad Caliphate is going to be a family of Sunni Muslims that will arise, and they are going to claim that they are the true successors of Muhammad. They are going to establish a caliphate, and they are going to greatly expand the borders of the Islamic world. We are going to see essentially Islam expand to almost its highest peak, you could argue. We are going to see that the Umayyad Caliphate stretches from Europe in the Iberian Peninsula. This means modern-day Spain and Portugal. We're going to see it span across North Africa. We'll see it expand all the way down into Sudan. But we're going to see it expand from Europe all the way to the Indus River. It's a huge expansion of Islamic faith and this Islamic empire. But there are going to be some political changes. This is largely a centralized caliphate, and the center of government is going to shift away from Mecca to the city of Damascus in modern-day Syria. Damascus is going to be the political center. It's also regarded as a cultural center as well. There's going to be the building of mosques, of key houses of worship in the Muslim faith. But this is going to be kind of a new political system, because unlike the Rashidun Caliphate, people that convert to Islam are not going to be considered full citizens. So there is going to be a strong preference for people who have been Muslim for, at this point, at least just a generation. Whoever was the original converts to Islam, they're considered the prime leaders in this Umayyad society. So Arabic Muslims are going to be preferred. We do have a rolling back of religious tolerance. So there's a lot of upset people in the Umayyad Caliphate. And this is going to help us explain why it's going to decline. For one thing, there is this religious intolerance. We do have groups of people, especially non-Arab Muslims, but also non-Arab Christians and Jews, are upset at this caliphate. But even among Muslims themselves, there is going to be this perception that the Umayyad Caliphate is corrupt and extravagant. They are living lives of luxury at the expense of this expectation in Islam of leading simple, humble lives, of engaging in charity. So there is this perception that the Umayyad caliphs are not interested in government, they are interested in enriching themselves. And eventually, all of these factors are going to lead to a change in government. We are going to see that an alliance of non-Arab Muslims and Christians and Jews, they are going to lead essentially a revolution in which another family is going to claim that they are the successors to Muhammad, and they are going to establish their own Islamic empire, their own caliphate. And that is going to be the Abbasids. So the Abbasid Caliphate is going to last quite a bit of time, but let's see what changes they're going to institute. Well, for one thing, they're going to move the center of the Islamic world, the center of Dar-al Islam, to the city of Baghdad in modern-day Iraq. So Baghdad is going to become yet another cultural center of the Islamic world, but it's also the political one as well. But the Abbasid Caliphate is notable in that it is going to promote religious tolerance. It is going to establish that people who convert to Islam, regardless of when they do it, regardless of when their family did it, that these converts are considered full citizens under the law in Abbasid Caliphate society. But they're also going to promote that idea of religious tolerance. And that is going to be kind of the labeling of groups of people as the people of the book. And essentially, this refers to people who are essentially referenced in the Quran. And that includes Jews, that includes Christians, that even includes Zoroastrians. So these people of the book, they are going to be respected. They will have their religious traditions remain intact if they so choose. The only thing that's put on them is a tax called the jizya tax. This is something that other Islamic empires will adopt. But we do have a time period of religious and political toleration. Baghdad is going to be a massive center of cultural learning during the Islamic Golden Age that we'll talk about towards the end of this presentation. And yet there are going to be several problems facing the Abbasid Caliphate, especially because it's so big, this empire. For one thing, we are going to see eventually the caliph take on more of a religious figurehead role, rather than being the guy directly in charge of government. As time wears on, we are going to start to see that extravagant and somewhat corrupt lifestyle return among these caliphs. They're going to be more focused on building up their harems. They're going to be more focused on
supporting and patronizing the arts. And increasingly, as the caliph takes on more of a religious and political position, or excuse me, a religious and cultural position rather than a political one, we see the rise of a political office known as the vizier or wazir. And essentially, the vizier is going to be in charge of government, directing government at the decree of the caliphs. But the vizier has significant power. So the caliphs themselves as people are going to lose their political importance over time. But there are other factors that will also diminish the Abbasid Caliphate, namely this idea of fragmentation. Different groups of people are going to break away from the Abbasid Caliphate, or they're going to invade the Abbasid Caliphate. So we do see invasions from outside groups, from Central Asian nomads. They return yet again. For instance, we have a group known as the Seljuk Turks in the 1100s. They're going to make significant territorial holdings in the Middle East. They are going to invade Baghdad at one point, and they're going to say to the caliph, you have no political power anymore, officially. You are just the religious leader of the Sunni Muslim world. But eventually, the end of the Abbasid Caliphate is going to come actually in our second unit, and that is going to be invasion by, you guessed it, the Mongols. They're going to burn down Baghdad. They're going to publicly execute the last Abbasid Caliph. And with that, we do see the start, or rather, I should say, the end of this major caliphate. And other groups of people are going to try and claim that they are the true successors of Muhammad. So we will see other Islamic societies pop up that are going to model themselves off of the Islamic world and off of the greatness of the Abbasids. And some of these other Islamic societies, I'm just going to rapid fire them. We have the Cordoba Caliphate in the Iberian Peninsula in modern-day Spain. So when the Umayyad fall, when they collapse, the dynasty is actually going to relocate to Spain. They're going to relocate to Muslim Spain. And we refer to a period of Spanish history, of Iberian history, in which the peninsula is ruled over by Muslims. This is a time period in which Spain is referred to as Al-Andalus. You might have heard that term before. But essentially, this is going to be a time period when we do have another Islamic caliphate that's going to be centered on the city of Cordoba. And in Cordoba, we are going to see a golden age of Islamic culture. We do see religious tolerance. We do see the reworking and translations of Greek and Roman philosophy. And this is in big contrast to what was going on in Western Europe at the time. We don't have the same cultural golden age that we do see in Spain. Eventually, the caliphate is going to fall apart into several smaller kingdoms. The Europeans will refer to them as Moorish kingdoms. So these are Muslims from North Africa that established kingdoms in Spain. And eventually, we do see that Christian kings will try and reconquer the rest of the Iberian Peninsula. But the Islamic presence in Spain is going to remain for over 700 years. We are going to see that there is a Muslim presence in Spain until 1492, and we'll discuss this date more later on. Another Islamic society that exists is going to be the Mamluk Sultanate. A sultanate is an Islamic kingdom ruled over by a sultan who doesn't have religious authority. But the Mamluk Sultanate is going to appear in Egypt, in modern-day Egypt. We are going to see it centered around a new city, the city of Cairo. Cairo, much like Cordoba, much like Damascus, much like Baghdad, it's going to be a center of culture and learning at this time. But the Mamluks have their origins as originally being slaves for the Abbasid Caliphate. They are they are Central Asian nomads who are taken in as slaves to serve in the Abbasid military. But the Mamluks are going to have significant political power as well. Eventually, they are going to break away from the Abbasid Caliphate and form their own Islamic society in Egypt. And this is what we refer to as the Mamluk Sultanate. So we do have this military force that is going to actually be a sense of continuity and stability in the Islamic world, even as the Mongols are invading. The Mamluks actually stick around until the Ottoman Empire, and we'll talk about them much more later on. But we also have other Islamic societies that will really show how Islam is spreading outside of the Arabic world, much like we saw with Cordoba. But let's look at a few of them. Well, in Persia, we do have the Samanid dynasty. This is going to be largely a Shia dynasty. And we see here an example of how Persian is going to become what we call Arabicized. It is going to take on Arabic writing styles. So we are going to see this kind of blending of Arabic Muslim and Persian culture together. So this is an example kind of how cultural tolerance does occur in Islamic societies, leading to unique forms of culture, ones in this case that are inspired by Persian ideas. And I think I mentioned in Unit 0 that Persia, that ancient Persia, is kind of viewed like how Rome is in Western Europe. The Persian Empire is the ideal empire. Let's model ourselves off of that. But another Islamic society that will appear in a largely non-Arab and even non-Muslim community is going to be the Delhi Sultanate. So the city of Delhi is obviously, as you might remember from last year, in India, in the Indian subcontinent. And eventually a Muslim empire will be established there after invasion by Persian-speaking Islamic invaders. So we do see the kind of creation of a unique expression of Islamic culture in the blending of Indian traditions, in the blending of Persian and Arabic and Muslim traditions in general. And we see that actually with this image right here. We'll talk about a very famous example of Indo-Persian architecture when we talk about the Mughals. But this right here is an example of Indo-Persian culture. We do have these. This is a mosque, a Muslim place of worship, but it's done in the style of both Indian architecture. You can see that kind of with these, the ribs, I suppose, is what you might call them, around the minaret right here. We'll talk about what that is later. But we also have, this is being used as a Muslim place of worship. And yet, despite these efforts to allow for, you could say, cultural syncretism, there is going to be this tense religious situation on the Indian subcontinent. Hindus are not mentioned in the Quran. They are not mentioned in the central holy text of Islam. They're polytheistic, a lot of these Hindu societies. So there is a bit of a religious conflict, especially initially when these Persian invaders come in. There's going to be the destruction of Hindu temples. And yet there are some attempts at syncretism, as you can see with this mosque right here, blending together traditions. But we also see that with this coin right here. On the one side, it says the traditional Islamic saying of some of these coins. This is an exact one that I'm thinking of. But there are coins that are issued by the Delhi Sultanate, in which one side will have in Arabic, Allah is God, and Muhammad is his prophet. But there is going to be a willing effort to try and blend traditions together, because while on the one side it's reaffirming monotheism, on the other side it's going to say in Sanskrit, Allah is a manifestation, or Muhammad is a manifestation of Allah. It's this idea of having kind of the notion of avatars being applied to Islamic society. This idea that Islam is just another form of Hinduism, according to Hindu scholars. And yet there are going to be a lot of tensions between Muslims and Hindus in India, as we will explore later on. The final Islamic society that I will mention, one that we'll talk about more in our second unit, is going to be the Kingdom of Ghana. Ghana is a sub-Saharan African society, but it's going to be connected to the Islamic world through trade routes. And eventually this Ghanan kingdom, they're going to adopt Islam as the basis of a new monarchy. So the spread of Islam to sub-Saharan Africa, as we'll explore later, is important because these societies
below the Saharan desert are largely going to organize themselves on the practices and teachings of Islam. They are going to be very much connected to these Islamic trade routes. But we'll talk about that more in a few chapters, actually, but also in our second unit. So how did Islam spread, and how is Islam including diverse groups of people? Let's look at Islamic society. This is where we'll wrap up in our presentation. So let's look at some key aspects that are going to be kind of similar throughout the Islamic world. So we have to look first at law. So under Islam, we do have, in many Islamic societies, we do have a legal and political system that is going to be based off the key central texts of Islam, meaning the Quran, but also the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, the Hadith. So Sharia is going to be kind of the basis of many Islamic communities throughout world history. So Islam is providing a sense of social order in the sense that it's providing not only a religious written document, but a legal one as well in the form of the Quran. So Sharia is going to be kind of applied across Islamic history. It's the basis for many Islamic kingdoms going forward. But we also see that from this legal system that a class of people will emerge known as the ulama. And the ulama essentially are legal scholars who are going to be a very important political force in future Islamic societies. The ulama are legal interpreters of the Quran and of the Hadith and how they apply that to political and legal traditions. And oftentimes, as we're going to see, the ulama are a very conservative force. They are opposed to outside influences. They are very much, you could say, strict interpretationists, strict interpretation of the key legal document in Islamic society, Sharia. And anything that goes against that, well, that's not really considered up to Sharia standard. So the ulama are going to be an important class of legal scholars in Islamic societies going forward, but they do, much like Neo-Confucian scholars, you could say, they are going to be very resistant towards change, towards reform, politically speaking. But from this very conservative group of Muslims, we are going to see that there are those that really want to take a more individual and spiritual look at Islam. And this idea is known as mysticism. It's this idea of kind of practicing unorthodox traditions, of practicing kind of rituals that aren't explicitly mentioned in the Quran. So we call this kind of branch of Islamic mysticism something known as Sufism. Sufism is going to be more appealing towards local customs, local traditions. It's less strict and conservative than the ulama and their interpretation of Sharia. So these Sufis are important in the sense that they are representing another form of Islamic culture. It's going to be very much focused on rituals such as meditation in the so-called practice of whirling dervish. You can see that in this example right here. It's this practice in which Sufis will essentially kind of pray through this very elaborate ritual of twirling around, of dancing. Some Sufis take mind-altering substances as well, but this is kind of an example of Islamic culture, but it's also going to be important in explaining why Islam will spread so much, because many of these Sufis, they're going to become early Islamic missionaries. So Sufis are going to oftentimes latch on to trade routes, and they're going to spread Islam across beyond the traditional borders of the caliphates. We will see Sufis going into Southeast Asia, as I'll talk about in a second, actually. But a big part of Islamic society, and kind of one that's building on that tradition of merchant trading in the Bedouin societies of the Arabian Peninsula, is going to be the idea of trade. If we think about trade, which is a huge topic for the AP exam,
we have to consider that it's largely going to be dominated initially by Muslims, by Muslim merchants. And there are a few reasons for that. For one thing, in establishing these Islamic empires, even though there might be several of them across the Islamic world, there is an overall sense of political stability. And when there's political stability, that allows for trade. We are going to see Muslim merchants being able to conduct trade because of political stability. We are also going to see, because of political stability, there are common coins throughout the Muslim world. In fact, we see Islamic coins as far as places like Norway. We see that because of the strength politically of things like the Abbasid Caliphate, that there's going to be a lot of trade that's promoted by a central authority, by a central political authority. But also, even though Sharia does have a very conservative outlook, if you interpret it through this conservative faction of the ulama, it does provide a sense of justice. It does provide a sense of legal equality that applies to everybody conducting business in the Islamic world. But there's also going to be a cultural reason why trade is going to be so promoted in the Islamic world, and that's because there's this shared language of Arabic. People are religiously and culturally expected to understand Arabic. That's going to translate literally into business transactions between different groups of people outside the Middle East, outside of the traditionally Arabic-speaking worlds. And we call this kind of shared language that's conducted by the business community lingua franca. A modern-day example of lingua franca is English. English is widely spoken as a business language around the world. But if we're thinking about way back in world history, it's Arabic. But we're also going to see how Muslims will come to dominate a lot of important trade routes in this early modern period. Muslims are going to take away the Indian dominance in the Indian Ocean trade. We are going to see Muslim merchants largely directing this. And these Muslim merchants, they're going to expand across wherever their trade routes are. In the case of the Indian Ocean, we're going to see Islam diffuse not just to the Indian coast, but to the coast of East Africa. We're going to see it diffuse into Southeast Asia, into places like modern-day Indonesia. And Indonesia, actually, to this day, is the country with the largest population of Muslims. So the Indian Ocean trade is allowing for Islamic diaspora, using that term we learn in Unit 0. We're also going to see Muslim merchants particularly dominate the Central Asian and the Middle East portions of the Silk Road. They are going to heavily utilize Bedouin trading tactics like using camels, for example, like using horses. But we also see Muslim overland merchants in the Saharan desert. And in this Saharan trade, we are going to see how Islam is going to spread to sub-Saharan Africa, into places like Ghana and, as we'll talk about later, Mali as well. But the trade routes that are established are going to have a few impacts. Most notably is what I discussed earlier, diffusion. So we're going to see diffusion, agriculturally speaking, through the exchange of diverse luxury goods, of diverse agricultural goods. For instance, we are going to see rice being diffused across the Islamic world. It's going to become a kind of staple crop in a way, not that important, but important enough in places like the Middle East. They are going to grow rice. We're going to see the spread of citrus across the international world. We are going to see citrus, for example, things like lemons being planted in Muslim Spain, in Al-Andalus. We're seeing even apples coming from Central Asia and being diffused along the Silk Road in the Islamic world into places as Europe. But we also see luxury goods as well that people very much want. Things like cotton are connected to these Islamic trade routes. Sugar is also connected. But arguably the most important is the intellectual diffusion that occurs as a result of these trade routes. Of course, we see Islam spreading. We do see Muslim communities popping up along these trade routes. But we're also going to see, thinking about Unit 0, the preservation and spread of Greek and Roman writing. literacy is very important in Islamic society. And that includes literacy in influences outside of the Islamic period. So we are going to see a very strong tradition emerging of preserving and retaining and translating Greek and Roman texts into Arabic. So the earliest preservation of classical literature, of not just the Greeks and the Romans, but the Persians as well, it's coming during this Islamic Golden Age. And we can kind of see that in these two images right here. This image right here is actually a Arabic translation, a Muslim translation of Socrates. Socrates is the guy in the center right there. This is the kind of the portraying the death of Socrates when he's forced to drink hemlock, when he's forced to drink that poison. But we also see this example of how Greek and Roman writing, specifically Greek and Roman science being preserved, is through architecture. Islamic architecture, as we're going to discuss later on, is preserving ideas that were first developed by the Greeks and the Romans. And you see that in this important mosque right here, the Dome on the Rock in Jerusalem, is combining the dome, it's combining arches in that are from Greek and Roman tradition into Islamic architecture. So we'll come back to this culture in just a second, but let's take a look at gender and slavery in the Islamic world. Because there are some misconceptions, I think, even to this day, of what exactly the role of women is in Islamic societies. Well, with the rise of Islam, we are going to see this kind of moral code being developed. And that's going to have a few changes in the role of women in Arabic societies. Because prior to Islam, in these Bedouin societies, we do see a matrilineal, actually, order of society that exists. But incorporating ideas from Christianity, incorporating patriarchal ideas from, say, the Romans and the Greeks, we are going to see this idea of religious modesty being publicly enforced. So women are going to have a kind of limited public role in Islamic societies, in at least these traditional Islamic societies. We do see the kind of public face coverings. That's going to be something that's emblematic of early Islamic societies. We do see that women are going to largely have a limited public role in the Islamic world. Oh, shoot. However, there are going to be some rights that are reserved for women, according to Quranic and Hadith, the Shari'ic traditions of Islam. For one thing, women are going to be guaranteed inheritance. Women can own property. Women can, mostly through their sons, kind of as the business transactors, they can own property. They can own businesses. Women can also remarry. The only thing about marriage is that divorce is rather difficult for Muslim women. So remarriage is possible in the Islamic world for women. Women also can have birth control in these Islamic societies. I don't know why that's relevant, but anyway. Well, I mean, I'm making a topical joke anyway. So there is kind of these allowances for women in Islamic society. And we're going to look at how this compares to, say, women in Christian Europe and how it compares to the Byzantine world. But let's look at slavery as well, because while this is going to be something that is developed in the, or not developed obviously, but it is going to be a practice in the Islamic world. We do have legal protections that you can't enslave certain groups of people. You can't enslave conquered Christians. You can't enslave conquered Jews, conquered Zoroastrians, and you especially can't enslave other Muslims. And yet, being a part of this trans-Saharan trade, being a part of this overland Silk Road trade, being a part of the Indian Ocean trade, slavery is going to be present in the Islamic world. However, slaves do have legal protection. Slaves are often viewed as being a part of an Islamic family. If you are a slave, you do have a guarantee that you could get your freedom. But notably also, as we'll come to see on our fourth unit, that slaves are not necessarily picked because of racial distinction. Slaves are just oftentimes kind of exchanged if they were already slaves. They are going to be, there is military slavery, as we saw with the Mamluks, but those are because of prisoners of war. It's kind of seen as justified, especially if you're not a Muslim. We do see the use of military slaves throughout Islamic history, actually. We're going to see it with the Mamluks, as we just saw, but we also will see it with the Janissaries as well. And we'll talk about who they are when we discuss the Ottoman Empire. But let's take a look now at Islamic culture. Well, as I mentioned before, education is very important. Literacy is extremely important. And as such, we are going to see not only a literature emerging that reflects Islamic themes, but we're also going to see this reclamation, this rediscovery of Greek and Roman texts. And we call this period of artistic and scientific discovery the Islamic Golden Age. This is a major impact of the rise of Islam in world history, as we will see. So we are going to see this largely emerge culturally because of the importance of literacy in this Islamic world, but also politically as well. The caliphs, especially the Abbasid Caliphate, they're going to be the public sponsors of institutions of learning, of universities, of a major house of learning, a public library, a public research institution known as the House of Wisdom. We see the building of buildings. That was a dumb statement. We see the building of institutions called madrasas as well in the Islamic world. So these are going to promote public education to people who have means for education. So we do see an explosion of art and science during the Islamic Golden Age, largely reclaiming the legacy of the classical world, of Greek and Roman translations, but also Persian culture as well. So we're going to see advances in the sciences and arts, some things that are obviously familiar to us today. So we do see that there will be advances in these sciences, especially in astronomy and map making. We do see that there is going to be an interest in reclaiming the astronomical legacies of the Roman, Greek, and Persian worlds. And we actually are going to see that, especially with a key figure in Islamic science, a guy by the name of Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. He's a Persian scholar who is going to have a lot of significance in scientific thought and astronomical thought. For one thing, he is going to be very much influential in the creation of what we call the heliocentric model of the universe. And essentially, the heliocentric model is going to be this idea, the crazy concept, that the solar system, that the center of the solar system is the sun, as opposed to the geocentric model, in which the Earth is the center of the solar system. And the heliocentric model is closer to what it actually is. This is going to be expanded on in Europe centuries later, during the during the scientific revolution, but we'll get there in our third unit. We're also going to see that Muslim scientists are making new inventions. One of the most notable is something known as the astrolabe. The astrolabe is a device that allows for accurate measurements of the stars. So we are going to see these great advances in astronomy that are going to have major impacts trade speaking wise. And that's because the astrolabe can be used in making accurate maps and allowing for better overseas transportation. Right now, this is mostly just confined to the Islamic world, but because of trade that we'll talk about later, these ideas will be diffused into Europe as well. We're also going to see the promotion and spread of something known as Arabic numerals. And the reason why I have Arabic numerals, well, first of all, what are they? Arabic numerals are what we have today. The concept of the zero is emerging during this time. The concept of having these characters for numbers, that's going to be very much something that is promoted during the Islamic Golden Age. So the concept of a zero, the written out numbers that we have in Western society today, 1, 2, 3, etc. I can't count.
these are going to be promoted and understood during the Islamic Golden Age. They're actually going to come from India, but they're going to spread across the world because of these Arabic Muslim-dominated trade routes. But we're also going to see advances and reclaiming some advances from the Greeks and Romans. We do see advances in geometry, we see trigonometry and calculus emerging during the Islamic Golden Age. In fact, we see the word algebra come from Arabic, algebra. It is an Arabic word, and we're seeing that because of this dominance of Muslim scientists. But we're also going to see advances in medicine as well. There is going to be a reclamation of Greek and Roman understanding of medicine. And we're going to very much see that as a result of these kind of translations of Greek and Roman writings. But we're going to see this expressed in the building of hospitals, of public institutions of health. So we do see very complicated and very modern in our, from our perspective, understandings of the natural world. Ideas of biology are being pioneered by Islamic scientists. We do have the successful dissections of eyes, so we know how optics works. And the text I have right here, this is, I believe, a algebraic treaty, algebraic thesis, I should say. This right here is a modern day, I believe, from Persia. I might be mistaken, but this is Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. This is an astrolabe right here. We're also going to see Islamic culture expressed in art as well. And they're going to see a few kind of instances of Islamic literature. We will see the translation of Persian tales, of Persian stories and mythologies that are going to comprise a book that might be familiar to you guys, actually. And one of the most notable pieces of literature in the Islamic Golden Age is 1001 Nights. That's going to be compiled a list of stories that very much sound familiar even to this day. Things like Aladdin, things like Sinbad and the 40 Thieves, they all come from this document, this book. But we also have opportunities for women in the Islamic Golden Age. We have the writings of a prominent female poet, Aisha al-Bawidiyah. So she is going to be one of these early examples of a female poet, and this is kind of a part of this Islamic Golden Age. But we also see advances in art as well. But Islamic art is going to take kind of a unique form. There will be visual paintings. There will be artistic depictions of human forms. However, Islam is largely going to be in line with this idea of strict monotheism, an iconoclastic religion. It's very much opposed to having religious figures, especially the Prophet Muhammad, being visually depicted. So there is going to be this reaction against kind of depicting religious figures directly, and rather most Islamic art is going to be focused on architecture and calligraphy. So calligraphy is going to often ordain the mosques, the religious temples of Islamic society. And these calligraphic, these religious writings are going to be oftentimes sayings and passages for the Quran. They're going to be very beautifully geometrically shaped, and we do see kind of also that focus on symmetry that's being applied to these mosques. In terms of architecture, we are going to see very unique forms of architecture emerging, largely that are going to reflect this reclaiming of the classical world, of Persian, Greek, and Roman influences. And we see that best expressed in the religious institutions of the Islamic world, in the mosque itself. The mosque is going to be kind of, has a few kind of major building features. We do see oftentimes mosques have domes, they have arches, as you can see in this example down here, but they also have minarets. And minarets, I showed earlier an example from India. That is a big old tower in which a Muslim leader, a Muslim religious community leader, would stand on top and announce the call to prayer, announcing people to come to the mosque
or at least to, in their homes, start praying, to pray on the prayer mat. But we're going to see a few examples. Mostly the ones I chose are actually going to be ones found in Europe, in Spain. One of them is the Alhambra in Spain, in Iberia. This is a big old Muslim palace that also serves as a fort, but it's showing kind of this very intentionally designed structure that does have a degree of beauty to it. It's not just a military fortification, but a palace as well. But another major example is one I showed earlier, actually, and that is the Mosque of Cordoba. The mosque, of course, being the central religious building in Islam, and we do see that right here. This is kind of the interior of it. You see these very ornate arches. It's eventually going to be converted into a church later on, but it's an example of this beauty in Islamic art. So what are some advances during the Islamic Golden Age? And think about this last question right here. How did the Islamic world promote continuity in world history? So if we're thinking about what we talked about in Unit 0, how did the Islamic world promote continuity with those ideas? All right, so I am done. Thank you very much. Have a great, wonderful day. You're all great. I didn't mean that sarcastically. You're all good. Have a great day. Keep it up. Good job. Thumbs up. Yay. All right, bye guys. I know sometimes I'm mean. I am mean, but that's just my humor. I want you to succeed. I want you to do well, and I don't dislike any of you. And on not the yeah, bye. Okay, outro. Leave a dislike, unsubscribe, and make sure you don't subscribe to my Patreon. I don't have a Patreon. All right, bye.